Coming up on BBC One, but first, here is the Andrew Marr Show.
Good morning. A big election victory, which this one certainly was, changes the whole political landscape. It might look familiar behind me this morning at Westminster. It should not feel familiar. A secure majority Tory government for England and a Scottish insurgency. One of the first challenges for the victorious David Cameron will be our relationship with the rest of the EU. This morning, the man who challenged Mr Cameron for the Tory leadership and came off not much better than Ed Miliband, David Davis, one of the party's big beast veterans, joins us to talk about the Tory future. But, of course, there were two big winners this week, and I'm joined as well by the generally acknowledged star of the 2015 campaign, the Scottish National Party leader, Nicola Sturgeon. She wanted to lock Mr Cameron out of Downing Street. Now he's locked himself in, but from there he's promised Scotland the strongest devolved government in the world. We'll hear her response as Alex Salmond says Scotland is moving nearer to independence. The Labour Party, particularly in England, is going to have to change radically or die. Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, was one of the small team of Blairite revolutionaries who created New Labour. Is it now time for New Labour? And one of the people already in the frame to replace Ed Miliband, Chuka Umunna, is here to tell us about the scale of the change his party now faces. On the papers, we have three very seasoned and much followed commentators. Tim Montgomery of The Times and the Good Right Project, The New Statesman's deputy editor Helen Lewis, and Baroness Ollie Grender, one of the vanquished Nick Clegg's closest confidants. An amazing amount to talk about this morning, but we'll start first with the news and John Akers.
Good morning. The Prime Minister has made more appointments to his cabinet 2 days after winning a majority in the House of Commons. Michael Gove, who was dropped as Education Secretary last year, replaces Chris Grayling as Justice Secretary. Mr Gove is expected to be followed as Chief Whip by Michael Harper. Our political correspondent Ross Hawkins reports from Downing Street.
Less than a year has passed since Michael Gove was demoted from a job he loved as Education Secretary to become the Conservative Chief Whip. Now he returns to lead a big government department, taking charge of prisons, sentencing and replacing the Human Rights Act. It means his predecessor as Justice Secretary, Chris Grayling, gets the lesser role of Leader of the House of Commons. Nicky Morgan, who replaced Michael Gove at Education last year, continues in that job. And Mark Harper, who resigned as an immigration minister after it emerged his cleaner didn't have permission to work in the UK, is expected to become the Conservative Chief Whip, in charge of discipline in a government with a slim majority and a debate about Europe looming. For Labour, with the shock and exhaustion of election night scarcely faded, the battle to replace Ed Miliband has begun. In the Sunday Times, Liz Kendall says they did not do enough to appeal to Conservative supporters. Writing in The Observer, Chuka Umunna says Labour had too little to say to the majority of people in the middle of society, as Labour asks itself fundamental questions about both who should lead and whether it must sound more like a party of the political centre ground. Ross Hawkins, BBC News in Westminster.
The final events to mark the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe are taking place across the country today. Following a concert in London last night, the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh and the Prince of Wales will attend a service at Westminster Abbey. Afterwards, veterans will parade along Whitehall past the balcony where Winston Churchill made two historic speeches. There will then be a flypast by Spitfires and Hurricanes. 17 people have been arrested by an anti-austerity rally in Westminster. Traffic cones and smoke bombs were thrown at police as they confronted demonstrators in Whitehall. 4 officers were injured. Police say the vast majority protested peacefully, but a small minority were intent on causing disorder. The Ministry of Defence says it has temporarily stopped using a new military transport plane after one crashed in Spain. 4 crew members were killed and 2 others were seriously injured. The Airbus A400M was undergoing a test flight at the time. And the TV BAFTAs take place tonight, honouring the best that the small screen has produced over the past 12 months. Benedict Cumberbatch is up for Best Leading Actor for his role in Sherlock, but there's some stiff competition from James Nesbitt for his performance in The Missing. Meanwhile, Sarah Lancashire is nominated for Best Actress for her role in the BBC One crime drama Happy Valley. That's all from me for now. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks, John. Now, you know what's on the front page of the papers: politics, politics and politics. But just to demonstrate that, there's Scotland on Sunday with Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond Hale's staging post to independence. We'll be talking about that later on. Sunday Times, Cameron launches blitz on Europe, and a very interesting piece by Robert Harris there at the back there, veteran commentator. Miliband was not weak, but tough, self-confident and deluded, he says. Very interesting piece indeed. And then we've got the Sunday Telegraph focusing on the SNP's dramatic new push for independence. Politics doesn't stop for very long after a big election result, you may have noticed. There's Samantha Cameron on the little wheelie. She appears in many of the papers. The Independent on Sunday, no honeymoon for Cameron, and the battle for Labour's heart, both the big stories there. And the Observer, they've got Tony Blair, we'll be talking about that as well shortly. Blair tells Labour, return to the centre ground to win again. And they've got the story of Michael Gove back on the front line as the Justice Secretary. And the Mail on Sunday is a story about the Speaker's wife and the hate mob in Number 10 Rampage. These were hard left demonstrators who sprayed graffiti on one of the World War II memorials, much to everybody's disgust. Welcome to you all. Now, I think we're going to start with Tim. You've got the Sunday Times, yes, and a very interesting piece there.
Yes, well, of course, we had an unexpected victory for the Conservatives, and now we're having everybody try and explain how and why he won. And some people, of course, particularly in Downing Street, would like to think it was all David Cameron's personality, his charisma, his sort of modernising. Allies want to say it was modernisation. But Owen Paterson, seen as more on the right of the Conservative Party, is saying, well, of course, the Tory manifesto included promises to cut taxes, to have the European referendum, give... So
it was old-fashioned Toryism.
Exactly. And the truth, of course, is that it was a blend of lots of things. Fundamentally, I think it was the economy and it was the weakness of the Labour leader. But the idea that the right are going to entirely interpret the Conservative majority as a vindication of everything David Cameron stands for, and somehow they are going to keep...
For Cameron. How does he respond to that? I mean, it's very hard for him to say, no, actually, it was all about me. It wasn't about the right, or... It's a hard thing for him to say.
It's a tricky thing, and, you know, obviously, lots of us, me included, didn't predict this victory, and his operation deserves a lot of credit. He deserves a lot of goodwill from people who didn't think he could do it. But I think the sort of article we're seeing from Owen Paterson, and there's quite a bit others in the newspapers, suggests that the right aren't just going to be meek and mild and subservient. It was the most rebellious parliament in the post-war period last time. Tory MPs got into a habit of rebelling. The majority that David Cameron has now, he's going to have to need very careful management of the party to get some of the more controversial things through.
What do you think he's going to have to do to get that? To give himself a good 5 years? How is the Number 10 operation going to have to change in the new Parliament as distinct from the last one?
I think it needs to be more collegiate. There's some sense from a lot of Conservative backbenchers that David Cameron often gave the impression that the Conservative Party was his personal possession, that him and George Osborne really were the only two people that mattered in the Conservative Party. Over the last 3 years, since Lynton Crosby, the Australian campaign guru, came into the operation, there's been someone who's been willing to stand up to David Cameron and say, no, this is the way you win elections, and David Cameron has listened to him. He needs perhaps a new chief of staff, someone who will also say, no, this is what your backbenchers are thinking of, Prime Minister, and they need to be heeded.
Very interesting indeed. Helen Lewis, in terms of big interventions in the papers, Tony Blair has arrived like a thunderbolt in the Observer.
And guess what? He's got a Blairite prospectus for what the Labour Party needs to do next. No real surprise there. He says the route to the mountain top, again, is through the centre ground. And this is an analysis that's going to appeal to a lot of people in Labour, yes. The idea that Labour lost because it was too left-wing. He does say that, you know, the focus on inequality was the right one, but he also talks a lot about the word aspiration, which we'll definitely be hearing more, and about the idea that perhaps that predators versus producers speech was a mistake by Ed Miliband.
I was struck by how generous-spirited he seemed to be about Ed Miliband, never his first choice as Labour leader.
But, you know, why not be at this? Yeah. I think you can be magnanimous when your analysis of what makes a winning Labour Party has essentially been vindicated. I think you can afford to be slightly kind about your successor. I think it's very interesting, though, that what will happen now, because actually it's the Labour Party now in the selection process over the last couple of years has delivered quite a left-wing parliamentary party, and that could store up a problem for a Blairite-style leader.
It's a very interesting thought. Ollie Grender, you're not going to have a lot of problems with big Lib Dem factions in the Commons in the future.
I wonder what a rebellion will look like for us from here on in. So this is an article, there's plenty of analysis, although buried slightly further down the papers, about what happened to the Lib Dems. And here's a piece in The Independent on Sunday, and you can see that Tim Farron has already declared that he's going for the leadership. I think what is quite interesting about this one is that even he is saying it was right to go into the coalition. So I just wonder, kind of whether anyone is going to have, there are some voices within the party that are saying it was wrong in the first place, although the vast majority of the party voted for it. I think what's also quite interesting about this one is that, there's going to need to be an opportunity to let off steam. But absolutely. I think over the next year, there'll be an awful lot of policies coming in to play from the Conservatives, which will explain very clearly why the Lib Dems had value. And our membership, for some extraordinary reason, has already shot up by nearly 5,000 since the polls closed, because people are aghast by the lack of a Liberal voice or a strong Liberal voice.
You were part of the campaign, obviously, which comes in for a fair amount of criticism.
It does.
To what
indeed.
extent were you completely blindsided, do you think, by the polls?
I think we were as blindsided as the Conservatives were, and I think that says it all. I mean,
did that make a difference, do you think? What
we knew very clearly was the strength of the argument that this is one of 23 seats that will prevent a Miliband SNP alliance. And that was very compelling for people. And the fact that the Conservatives had, kind of vast quantities of cash, which meant that they could ring almost every member of the electorate in critical seats and say that message. And that message was compelling.
Tim, now there's lots of personal stories, but you have chosen one of the, in a sense, saddest but also funniest stories, yes. I suppose. It's Liam Byrne.
Well, David Cameron didn't seem to go anywhere on the campaign trail without that note that Liam Byrne famously left in the Treasury, saying there was no money left. And poor Liam Byrne, I feel slightly sorry for him. He says in this article in the Observer that he's mortified on a daily basis that he put this albatross...
burned with shame for 5 years. And it was presumably a kind of office joke. It was meant to be a joke.
Yes, it's a tradition that when a minister leaves office, they leave a note for their successor with a little bit of pithy advice or a joke, and I think he regrets it. But he shouldn't regret it too much in a way. The problem wasn't the note. The problem was that there was no money left. And the danger for the Labour Party...
Didn't know that David Laws was not going to be a success with a great sense of humour.
No, David Laws was a little bit naughty perhaps to release this note, but it was released. But the big problem is that Labour did never face up to the fact that they did overspend during the boom years. We had one of the biggest increases in public spending anywhere in the OECD. And that is the big challenge for the new Labour leadership race. Will they acknowledge, actually, that their economic incompetence
We're going to come on to that, I promise, later in the programme. But the really big story we haven't talked about features my main guest today, the SNP and the Scottish insurgency. And Helen, you've got the Telegraph.
I have, and actually the group of 56 SNP MPs is so big that I can only show you half of it. They were all rayed out yesterday behind Nicola Sturgeon. And this is absolutely unprecedented and incredible. But what's quite fascinating is that already they're having a bit of an ego problem. So Alex Salmond is already talking about the fact that he thinks this has brought a second independence referendum nearer. The trouble was when Nicola Sturgeon made a reference to that in the debates, it didn't go down very well. And I think that there will be a difference of opinion between people who feel that they voted for an anti-austerity party, and actually for them the second referendum is not the biggest issue for them at all.
Absolutely. It's always very dangerous to have a leadership psychodrama at the top, which the Labour Party could have told them. Anyway, moving straight on to Andrew Rawnsley's column in The Observer.
So Andrew Rawnsley's column and this fabulous Riddell cartoon above it, which shows that the XXXs are back, Dave, as John Major famously described them. I'm not going to use the word here on TV in case any kiddies are watching.
Thank you.
Yes, this is going to be a massive problem, which is the fracturing of David Cameron's party when it comes to the European referendum. And he is going to have a real struggle with the people that he has, as well as, I think, kind of what is he renegotiating for? Because frankly, every time we've had a look at that, when we were in partnership with them, we consistently had more ideas than they did about what to renegotiate. I think they're going to struggle on that, and I think then it's going to be, as Andrew Rawnsley puts it, it'll be even worse than under John Major's day.
All right, now In terms of boosting the power of the press, Long Tall Sally's a one-woman campaign for higher newspaper circulation, and she's been at it again, the Mail on Sunday.
Well, I don't dwell with what's on the front page of the Mail on Sunday about John Berg and Sally Berkow's private life, but the Speaker will be re-elected quite soon, or not re-elected quite soon.
The suggestion seems to be that he will be, that the Conservatives won't block him the way that we thought they were going to.
Well, I hope they won't. There's talk in the Mail on Sunday that he's a Labour-friendly Speaker. There may be a little bit of truth to that, but the more important thing about John Bercow, he's a backbench-friendly Speaker. He's a Parliament-friendly Speaker. Now, that annoys a government, of course, because they want to control everything. But actually, with a Tory majority, with the opposition so divided, actually you want a Speaker who's going to champion Parliament.
Quite right.
I hope, even though he's an awkward so-and-so sometimes, and a little bit cocky and talks too much at PMQs, we need him.
We need him. Very good. Now, crucial to us today is Chukwuemeka, who's coming on the programme shortly. Helen, that's his piece in The Observer. Just talk us through it.
Yeah, well, after the post-mortem, then the vision of the sunlit uplands of what can happen next, I think. So, actually, Chukwuemeka and Liz Kendall have both been straight out of the traps. To the slight disgruntlement of some of the people who haven't announced yet. One of them told my colleague George Eaton it's like people taking the jewellery off a corpse, which is one way of putting it. But I think that they both think that they are at a disadvantage. These are both people from the 2010 intake, whereas the established candidates, Yvette Cooper and Andy Burnham, both have had very high-profile roles. A quick leadership election in which other candidates don't have a chance to establish themselves will benefit them. He uses
quite strong language about Labour's failures in this piece, doesn't he, Helen?
He does, and to his credit, it was something that he said to the New Statesman and other people before the election, the idea that...
So this is not just after the event?
This is not just the benefit of hindsight. He had always said that we need to look like we don't just enjoy taxing people for the sake of it, that there is a point to taxing people. And as the person who was a shadow business secretary, he knew, he bore the brunt of the fact that business was very suspicious of Labour. And I'm sure we'll have a very strong opinion on whether or not that cost it a crucial number of votes on economic competence.
Should be very interesting. We're running out of time, so we have to rush through the last few stories, if you don't mind.
OK, so a big story that we're all going to look at again and again, as we did post-92, is what happened with the polls. And how much we featured the polls and trusted the polls and found them to be wrong.
We're all going to have to spend less time talking about the polls in the next election, are we not, comrades?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes, we agree about that. Yeah. Marvellous. OK. A story from you from the Mail again about Russell Brand.
He didn't have a very good election, Russell Brand. First of all, don't vote, then vote Green, then vote Labour, then he was all sort of sorry about it at the end. But of course, what he's most known for is his anti-capitalism. And the Mail on Sunday has discovered that he's actually registered his Revolution trademark so that no one else can profit from it, and that he can sell all the T-shirts with. So actually, the anti-capitalist is a little bit more capitalist than we realised.
Beyond satire, very briefly, we've got a great story about what we eat on.
Basically, it's a campaign to bring back plates. I think people have discovered that, I think this is the gastropub broom kicked this off, but there's such things as mushrooms being served on a shovel, someone eating a cake off a ping-pong bat, and I think...
Hats, kilts, all of that stuff.
People need to slightly calm down and go back to plates.
All of that stuff. And finally, Ollie, the big other story of the day.
Really,
really important.
And we can see it all happening behind us here in Westminster, people gathering for the VE Day celebrations, and it's going to, there's some lovely pictures here. So that's a kind of a nice rest after the
and a reminder that politics could be brutal, but there are much more brutal ways of settling differences. Exactly 70 years on. Thank you all very much indeed. Fascinating paper review. Well, a sunny morning here in Westminster, just in time for the VE Day commemorations later on. So over to the weather studio now, and more with Chris Fawkes.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Yes, the sunshine put a tentative toe outside through the clouds. Sunny spells developing, and across England and Wales, actually, things will improve through the rest of the day. Most of us will see some sunshine later on, but at the same time, it's not quite so nice in Northern Ireland and Scotland, where we have outbreaks of rain that will increasingly turn heavy and persistent through this afternoon. Still, where the sunshine does come out, a much warmer afternoon across northeast England compared with yesterday. 7 degrees warmer in some places. The highest temperature is likely to be across 20 degrees Celsius in East Anglia and South East England. Overnight, our band of rain slowly drags its heels and slips across Scotland and Northern Ireland, reaching the far northwest of England and Wales, turning murky across the hills of southern Wales and southwest England by the end of the night as well. And for Monday, our weather front continues to slide southwards into an area of high pressure, which will tend to squish the front. So by the time we get to Monday afternoon, there'll be little more than a lump of cloud working across the Midlands. Sunshine and showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Most of us actually will have some sunshine. And in that sunshine, with southerly winds wafting some warm air up from France, temperatures reached 24 degrees, the warmest weather of the week ahead. Looking at the rest of the week, though, things not looking too bad. Sunshine, 1 or 2 showers, particularly across northwestern areas on Tuesday, where it will also be quite windy, but the weather will tend to go downhill as we get towards Thursday. It turns unsettled with low pressure moving in. It'll turn wet for most areas with outbreaks of rain on the horizon. That's how the weather's shaping up. Back to you, Andrew.
Could be a lot worse. Now, there's no doubt the Conservatives' election victory is also a personal vindication for the Prime Minister. He led his party to its longed-for majority, the sweetest victory, as he called it. But that majority is still relatively slender and therefore vulnerable to natural attrition, as we call it, and perhaps internal dissent. David Davis is a senior backbencher. He lost out to Mr Cameron in the leadership election. It seems amazing, but 10 years ago, and he's with me now. Doesn't seem like 10 years ago, does it?
It seems like yesterday.
Seems like yesterday. Now, first of all, what do you think the number 10 operation has to do in this new Parliament that it wasn't doing in the last Parliament to sort of enjoy the next 5 years?
Well, it started, actually, already. They've already seen Graham Brady. He was called in, I think, on beginning of the weekend, Friday, I think, to talk to him. And he's very, very important in this. He's the head of the 22 committee, the representative committee for the backbenchers. They must treat him with respect because he's their bridge, and they must actually use that to talk to the backbenchers.
Some people say that David Cameron had slightly too much of whether it was a clique or not, there was an impression that it was a clique of mates and friends, and it has to reach out much more to the Tory party.
There's certainly that impression, but there's also another problem. Whenever they struck a deal with the Liberals on some issue, they were fixed. They couldn't go out and then renegotiate that deal with their own backbenchers or the Lords or whatever. So I think there were two aspects to it.
But that makes it harder for David Cameron in a sense, because in the past he could say to critics on the right of the Conservative Party, I'm terribly sorry, I agree with you. Unfortunately, that wretched Nick Clegg has stopped me doing it. He can't say that now, can he?
No, he can't, but he's also free to move. And look, one of the things that's interesting about David is when he thinks the circumstances have changed, he can change his mind. He's done that publicly a number of times. Early on in this government, he got criticised for changing his mind on forests and you name it. So I think he's good at that. So from that point of view, he can actually manage it better.
Now, of all the big issues, we both know that Europe is the most potentially toxic. I remember very, very well the John Major years where you were the enforcer and so forth for a long time. Now, what do you think he has to bring back, essentially, from the EU negotiations? He's got the maximum power now. He has to strike while the iron is hot. So what does he need to get from them?
Before that, I don't think we'll repeat the Major days for 3 reasons. One, we've done it before. We know what it feels like. 2, people have got the option of talking to him more, I think, than before. And 3, if they don't like the outcome, they can actually campaign against it in a referendum. So I think there are reasons why it won't happen. Now, what does he need to bring back? I would put actually immigration, very important in the public mind, to one side. It's not the big issue.
So the free movement of people is
not important. It's important, but it's not the main one. The main one is very simple. The main one is that in the future we are able to say to the Europeans, look, this is too far for us. An opt-out, not a veto, an opt-out. There is one already for France. There's a thing called the Luxembourg Compromise. France on a couple of occasions said, this is going to damage our shipping industry, we don't want it, and they effectively brought it to an end.
In a sense, to restore some power to the building behind us.
Exactly. It's all about that. It's all about restoring control of our destiny to the House of Commons.
All right. Now, what about but the free movement of people thing, which we talked about endlessly before the election? You say that's not so important. Why
Well, I
not?
think it's a secondary one. I mean, it will be the one he's measured by in the public eye, and the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail will look at it. But the trouble is, at the moment, the focus is on things like benefit tourism and so on. That's not the issue. We haven't got millions of people here on benefits. We've got millions of people here in jobs. And so that's going to be quite hard to get right. But they need to try. But it'll be
so
hard to
if we got a kind of Luxembourg compromise, a bit more veto power, as it were, for Britain.
That's the single most important thing.
If we got that, would you be in favour of staying in the EU?
I think I would. That's for me the acid test. It's not the only one, I'll grant you, but it is the central one.
OK, that's Europe. Tick. Let's move on to the next big problem, which is Scotland. Because we hear that it's going to be a very more radical form of home rule, but is that enough? What about the money? What's your view?
Well, you know, Andrew, from your previous incarnation at the Independent, that I was in favour of fiscal autonomy, as it were, right back at the beginning of this, the 90s. And that's what Nicola Sturgeon says she wants, but they want complete fiscal autonomy, and there's a real problem with that. And that is that the Scots essentially raise 3% less tax per person than the rest of the UK, and they spend 15% more money. So actually, if they had proper, complete control of the money, or virtually complete control of the money, they'd be in permanent deficit.
Isn't that the sword that David Cameron is going to kind of dangle over Nicola Sturgeon's head? OK, fine, you can have freedom, you spend the money, you raise the money, Scottish taxpayers have to take the whole hit for any anti-austerity policies. Isn't that, as it were, a Tory threat?
I think that's what responsible politics is about, is actually paying for what you do. But understand that we've had a grievance machine in place since the Scotland Act, the first Scotland Act. Gordon Brown, I told him, I was Public Accounts Committee Chairman, I said, what you're doing is creating a permanent excuse for every Scotland Act to say it's Westminster's fault by having us pay the bills all the time. They should raise the money in Scotland and raise enough to pay for what they got responsibility for, and then it's their responsibility. They should want that. If they want independence, this is halfway house.
And you're a great enthusiast, I think, for English votes for English laws.
Yeah.
But does that not push us towards an entirely federal system where we have, in effect, that building becomes a kind of English parliament?
Or 3 days a week it does, or 2 days a week, whatever it might be. Yes, it does. I mean, one of the reasons the British establishment has resisted English votes over time is they know eventually that means you're going to have an English health minister, an English education minister, and I suspect one day an English first minister. And whoever's the occupant at number 10 would hate that, because actually all the power
unless it was the same person, of course. Yeah.
Unless it's the same person.
So actually our entire country is changing before our
Absolutely.
eyes. A federal Britain, a new kind of English parliament, a new relationship with Europe. This is a very, very big day.
This is one of my colleagues was thinking of standing down, quite important ex-cabinet minister was thinking of standing down this election. He said, I can't. Too many important things are going to happen in the next 5 years. Yeah. And he's dead right. This is actually a turning point in history. We always say the current election is the most important one ever. Actually, this time, it might have been. It
really is. Now, you took him on 10 years ago. Yeah. He's done pretty well, hasn't he?
He has done pretty well. I mean, the thing I say about this election, nobody said it, but, and I said to you earlier, I sort of called it in the middle of the night, a little earlier than some of the others, but I was wrong as well. But the simple truth is, they maintained a campaign against the run of conventional wisdom. So it was a brave campaign, and in this occasion, courage has been paid off.
David Davis, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, apart from David Cameron, obviously, the big winner on election night was the SNP leader and Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. She wasn't standing for Westminster herself, of course, but her party is sending 56 MPs back to the House of Commons behind me. The SNP won all but 3 of the seats in Scotland, a staggering result, which she says will ensure that Scotland's voice is heard loud and clear. Nicola Sturgeon has already been talking to the Prime Minister by phone, and no doubt they'll be meeting soon. The First Minister is with me now. Welcome.
Good morning, Andrew.
How was your phone call?
It was very courteous. It was a brief phone call, as you would expect, just a few hours after the final result was confirmed. I congratulated him. I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets here when I say I would have preferred David Cameron not to continue as Prime Minister, but he won the election. I congratulated him on that. He congratulated the SNP on our success. We agreed to meet as soon as possible. There are big issues for us to discuss. The key point I wanted to make to him, and did make to him, was this one. He cannot act now as if it's business as usual in Scotland. Scotland voted overwhelmingly for change, and I think that has to be heeded.
You said one thing that I didn't really understand in the wake of the victory, which is that this was a vote to stop austerity taking place across the UK. You don't have the votes to do that. You can't do that, can you?
Well, we put ending austerity as the #1 priority in our manifesto, and when I launched the SNP manifesto, which is about 3 weeks ago now, I was very explicit that that was the top priority. 50% of people in Scotland voted for that manifesto with that commitment to end austerity. Now, that can't simply be ignored. What we said in our manifesto, which is what people in Scotland voted for comprehensively, has to be listened to. And, OK, there are discussions to be had and the detail of those discussions to be got into. But if David Cameron thinks, and I'm not saying he does, but if he thinks he can just carry on as if nothing happened in Scotland on Thursday, then he's wrong.
Well, but on the austerity issue, I mean, the vast majority of the overall majority of MPs elected into the House of Commons across the UK are from the anti-austerity party. They're the ones with the votes. There's nothing that you can do in the House of Commons to prevent austerity happening. Nothing at all. You haven't got the numbers.
Well, Scotland clearly doesn't want austerity to continue, and there are discussions we will require to have about the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government's budget. discussions that I will want to have about £12 billion of welfare cuts that David Cameron didn't specify during the election that will hit disabled people. So these are discussions we need to have, and the will of the Scottish people has to be listened to. I think it's likely, given that Labour are entering a period of introspection, questioning their very purpose in life, the SNP is going to be the principal opposition to the Conservatives.
All I'm saying, but you can't stop him doing what he wants now.
We'll seek to build alliances with others, and we will seek to make sure that those issues that we put at the heart of the campaign go to the heart of the Westminster agenda. And during the campaign, I was at pains to hold out a hand of friendship to people across the rest of the UK. And I know there are people in England, Wales and Northern Ireland who will be as disappointed as people in Scotland that we're looking at a majority Conservative government. We can be a voice for them as the opposition to David Cameron. But in the end, a majority
is a majority is a majority.
Yeah, it's a slender majority, and 56 SNP MPs will be there to make Scotland's voice heard, but also to stand up for the progressive politics that we very deliberately put at the heart of our campaign.
In terms of the Scottish budget, it's perfectly clear a lot of Conservative MPs, and you heard David Davis perhaps just now, are saying, look, we're going to give you full fiscal autonomy. If you want to end austerity, you want higher public spending in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, that's absolutely fine, but you can do it by raising money on the backs of Scottish taxpayers alone. That is their proposition to you.
Well, if they think giving Scotland responsibility and power is some kind of threat to the SNP, then they don't understand much about the SNP.
That, would you?
Our manifesto set out very clearly that we would want to move to full fiscal responsibility. Clearly that will take a number of years to implement. What we are arguing for, and what we will argue for, is priority devolution of powers over business taxes, employment, the minimum wage, welfare, because these are the levers we need to grow our economy faster, to get more people into work, paying taxes and lifting people out of poverty. So interestingly, the final point I would make here is David Cameron didn't give me any indication that he wanted to move beyond the current Smith Commission proposals. I think he has to, and that clearly is one of the things we're going to have to discuss.
I think a lot of people think he has to do that. But if he says to you, OK, here are the levers you want, but in return it's the end of the Barnett formula, it's the end of any cross-subsidy, we are moving to full fiscal autonomy for Scotland within 2 years, you'd say that's a good deal.
Well, we would have to make sure that was a good deal, because one of the issues around full fiscal autonomy would be a fiscal agreement between a fiscal framework between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, and there would be some issues in that it would be the responsibility of the Scottish Government and our MPs down in the House of Commons to make sure we got a good deal. There would be questions about how much Scotland contributed to continued reserved responsibilities like defence, how much we contributed to debt interest payments. So, there are clearly some big discussions to be had there. Now, we haven't got into the detail of those discussions. My starting point, though, is that Scotland's voice has to be heard, and it is the job now of the MPs we've elected to this place to make sure that happens.
And you're the leader, not, of course, of the Scottish Nationalist Party, but of the Scottish National Party.
Absolutely.
And some people say that actually the most comfortable thing for Scotland for quite a few years ahead would be Home Rule all round, would be a new federal settlement for Britain, and that actually might be a better option than early independence.
Well, we had the independence referendum last year. I campaigned very hard for a yes vote, as you saw. Scotland didn't vote yes in the referendum. There's not another referendum, on the immediate horizon. So what we have to do now is make sure we get the best deal for Scotland within the Westminster system, make sure Scotland's voice is heard, and also play a constructive role in that system. I'm very conscious, as I said a moment ago, that we will be perhaps the principal and most effective opposition to the Tories in the House of Commons. That gives us a responsibility to speak up for progressive politics on behalf of people not just in Scotland but right across these islands.
But a sort of home rule all-round federal Britain might suit a lot of people for quite a long time to come.
I know that I want more powers for Scotland. It's not for me to dictate to other parts of the UK, whether that's regions of England or Wales, what the right settlement for them might be. But, the more power that is decentralised out of this place behind us here, perhaps the better for everybody across the UK.
Well, let's talk about independence, because Alex Salmond said very clearly yesterday, I think, that this was a stepping stone to independence, this vote. Do you agree with him?
What Alex said, and I don't think it's a particularly controversial statement, is that he thinks Scotland will become an independent country. I think Scotland will become an independent country one day. He said he thinks it will be in his lifetime.
But
I hope that's the case.
Do you think this general election campaign has moved Scotland further?
This general election campaign, and there's no disagreement between Alec and I on this, this general election campaign was not about independence. I said that repeatedly, I said it consistently, and I said expressly to people in Scotland that if they voted SNP, and half of the Scottish population did, I would not take that as an endorsement of independence.
So that's a personal integrity thing, because Alex Salmond did say he thought it did move Scotland further after the result, and then people said, aha, they're changing their tune already.
Well, none of us are changing our tune. I'm a great believer in what you say before an election should be what you say after an election. I said, and I said it directly to people, and many people who voted no for independence in the referendum, who would vote no if the referendum was tomorrow, voted SNP on Thursday. Now, I've got a responsibility to make sure that we represent all of them, but also that we represent those who didn't vote for us and seek to win their trust. You said our name is the Scottish National Party. You're absolutely right about that. As First Minister, as leader of the SNP, I've got a responsibility to try to unite Scotland, and I'm determined that I do that.
Now, looking ahead, one of the big issues, of course, is Europe. You said again during the election campaign that it would have to be something pretty big to persuade you to put an independence referendum back on the 2016 Holyrood Manifesto. Can I take it that that would have to be something really cataclysmic, not on the horizon, unlikely to happen?
Well, you know, the one example I've used, I think the last time we spoke, I said I'm not going to give you a list because I cannot see into the future. It would have to be something significant and material. The example I have used is if there was an in-out referendum, and clearly with a majority Tory government that must be on the horizon, and Scotland voted to stay in the EU and the rest of the UK voted to come out. You know, I think there would be a significant opinion in Scotland that said we had to relook at the issue of independence. But I actually want to have an arrangement to stop that happening.
I'm sorry to press you on this, but to be clear, failing to get what you want on austerity with David Cameron in those negotiations wouldn't be a cataclysmic event sufficient to put an independence referendum back on the table.
The example I've used is the one I've given. That gives you some idea of what I'm talking about. But clearly we're some distance away from finalising our 2016 manifesto. When we do, people will be able to scrutinise it and decide whether to vote for the SNP on the strength of that. The point I was going to go on to make about Europe is I actually want to have an arrangement, if there is an in-out referendum, which I don't want there to be, that would avoid the scenario that I'm talking about. Let's have that double majority so that each of the 4 constituent parts of the UK would have to vote to come out before that happened.
I've been popping in and out of Scotland. I haven't been there the whole time the last few weeks, but it has felt more like a national revolution, an extraordinary upsurging than politics as usual. My question is, you've got 100,000 new members in the SNP.
110,000.
110,000, I beg your pardon, new members. Wow. Changes every day, and massive numbers of voters who voted SNP for the first time in the hope of real change, big change. Can you control your party?
Yes.
OK, that's very firm, yes.
You know, the SNP is a party that is much bigger than it was. It is enthusiastic. It is absolutely passionate about politics and making Scotland a better place. It's also pragmatic and understands that we've got a responsibility to represent all of Scotland. I have no concerns about that at all. What is wonderful, and it's not just about the SNP, it's about Scotland as a whole, that one of the great legacies of the referendum campaign is that we have a population that is interested in, engaged with and enthused about politics, and other countries I'm sure would give their eye teeth for that.
We're going to have lots and lots of big political discussions down here over the next 5 years. Who am I going to be talking to as the main voice of the SNP?
I'm the leader of the SNP, so I hope we'll be talking many times, but I also hope many of my colleagues will be sitting in this chair or the one in your usual studio on many occasions. We're the 3rd biggest party in this place now, so I hope you'll be talking to lots of us.
We've noticed. Nicola Sturgeon, for now, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Lord Mandelson has been one of the most influential figures in the Labour Party and British politics more generally over the past 30 years. He knows a thing or two about recovering from election defeats, of course. He masterminded the creation of New Labour and Tony Blair's progress to Downing Street, and he went on to be a senior cabinet minister himself and a European commissioner. So how does he see the challenges ahead for his own party and indeed for the new government? Well, just on cue, here he is. Welcome to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Ed Miliband, there's been a lot of kind words spoken about him over the past few hours. What do you think of his record as a Labour leader? Where did he go wrong? Where did he go right?
Well, let me first of all say, if I may, Andrew, I want to pay a tribute to Ed because he delivered a passionate and a professional performance during this campaign. And I commiserate too with people like Ed Balls and Douglas Alexander and other candidates who lost their seats, and I hope they'll come back. But let me say this too. The awful, shocking thing about this election is that Labour could have won it. Or at least come a very near second.
How could Labour
and the reason we lost it, well, the reason we lost it, and lost it so badly, was because in 2010, we discarded New Labour rather than revitalising it and re-energising it and making it relevant for the new times, the new policy challenges that we face.
But doesn't
and that was a terrible mistake.
But doesn't that mean that the man to whom you paid such a fulsome tribute just now was the wrong Labour leader, that they should have gone for the other brother?
Well, in a sense, we were sent off in 2010 on a sort of giant political experiment in which we were sort of sent out and told to sort of wave our fists, you know, angrily at the nasty Tories and wait for the public to realise how much they had missed us. Well, they weren't missing us, and they didn't miss us. Instead, they ripped the sort of stripes off our shoulders, and that really is the depth of our defeat and the scale of the challenge we face now. Look, I was there in the 1980s and the early 90s, Andrew, as the party's campaign director. I think now that the scale of the sort of challenge we face and the need for rethinking and remodernisation of the party is akin to the sort of scale of challenge that we faced in the late 1980s. That's how serious it is.
So that is a terrible, terrible legacy for Ed Miliband's leadership, is it not?
It is a measure of how far we have to go and what we have to do in order to climb back. And far from embarking on a sort of, you know, short-term beauty contest of leaders, what we really need is a very, very thorough debate in the party of the sort that was denied us in 2010.
It's hard to kind of visualise sometimes the scale of change that needs to happen, but I was stopped in the street just a couple of days ago by a guy who was a builder, a painter and decorator, really employed 6 people, and he said, I can't possibly vote Labour. They hate people like me. They hate wealth creators. They hate people who employ other people. Is that the core of the problem, do you think?
It is part of the core of the problem. Yeah. I mean, literally we were sent out and told to say things and to make an argument, if you can call it an argument, which basically said, you know, we're for the poor, we hate the rich, ignoring completely the vast swathe of the population who exist in between. I mean, who do have values like ours. I mean, they do like the Labour Party. They are committed to social justice and to fairness. And they do want a government like ours that leans heavily against inequalities in society, but they also want a government that is economically competent and also realises that people have aspirations. They live in the real world. They want to better themselves. And if we're not with them in that and not so totally committed to seeing them doing that, why on earth should they vote for us?
So what did you think when you heard that very famous predators versus producers speech?
I thought it was a completely useless label that led nowhere in any serious debate, both about the partnership that we need to have with business, but also how business needs to change. We do need a reformed, a more responsible capitalism in our country. I said that, I argued that when I was the business secretary. Of course we do. But shall I tell you something else? Most people in business realise as well that we have to live for the long term, not sort of short-term financial interests. And we have to think about how we're going to embrace the new technologies that are available to us in order to drive up our productivity and our competitiveness. That is what the real world is about.
Was it a mistake not to acknowledge that in the last years of Gordon Brown's administration, the Labour Party was spending more than it should have done in power?
Look, we based our level of spending on what we assumed would be continuing economic growth. That didn't happen. We had a banking crisis. So could you not have said,
with the benefit of hindsight, we wish you'd done it better, we wish we'd done it differently?
Oh, I think we should have said that not every pound of public spending we made was at the end of the day wholly wise or wholly justified or whatever. But don't make any mistake about this. Labour overspending did not cause the banking crisis. No. And when the banking crisis came, we had to borrow an enormous amount in order to put on sort of fuel in order to speed out of that crisis. Otherwise, our economy would have shot over a cliff.
Now, you want a big philosophical debate about the Labour Party, but there is also a leadership contest already starting. What do you think about the current way that's being done? One member, one vote, the involvement of many union members and so forth in that?
Well, we have new rules. I'm assuming we have new rules, which are, broadly speaking, based on one member, one vote. but there is also provision for something in the region of 2.5 million political levy-paying trade unionists who are being invited to declare themselves as Labour supporters, enrolled as affiliated supporters of the Labour Party without having to do anything else, and then given a vote in this campaign. Well, in this contest, what I say to that is that, you know, if we're going to have people declaring that they're Labour supporters in that way and given a vote, then every single one of those individuals needs to be validated by the party staff and the party headquarters. We cannot open ourselves up, Andrew, to the sort of abuse and inappropriate influence that the trade unions weighed in with in our leadership election in 2010.
To be absolutely clear, what you're worried about is trade union organisers and leaders fixing the leadership contest for the Labour Party by strong-arming people or persuading people first to sign up and then to vote for a particular candidate.
In 2010, the trade union machines, or certain of them, I mean, basically Unite and Unison, basically put Ed Miliband's photograph on their ballot papers and put his election material in the ballot envelopes. You know, no other candidate got a look in. Now, that is the sort of abuse by trade union machines, not by individual trade unionists, but by trade union machines, that we must guard against this time.
Do you think the time has come for the Labour Party to think about breaking the link with the trade unions?
I think it is incredibly unhealthy for us to be so dependent on trade union funding. So whilst I believe the trade unions have an important role both to play in society and politics, and I want to see it continuing, I am not happy with the Labour Party that is so clearly dependent on people who, you know, pay the piper and then in many cases can call the tune. That's not a good look. It's not right for a Labour Party appealing for votes in the 21st century.
Very clear. Lord Mandelson, for now, thank you very much indeed. Now, events tend to move fast after an election defeat, as you'll have spotted, and no sooner had Ed Miliband announced his resignation than the bookies started taking money on who was going to succeed him. We'll find out more this week about the timetable for Labour to choose its new leader and those rules that Lord Mandelson was talking about. But everyone seems to agree that the party needs to take a good, hard look at itself, what it stands for, how to win back key supporters. And as we heard, one of the people hoping to shape that debate is Chuka Umunna. He's written a hard-hitting piece in today's Observer, and he's with me now. Welcome.
Morning, Andrew.
Good morning. Now, you heard what Lord Mandelson was saying. Are you happy with the way these rules are going to operate inside the Labour Party for the leadership campaign?
Well, one of Ed's great legacies was to reform our party, and we've put in place a series of new rules and reforms that opens out the party and provides us with the opportunity to grow the party during a future leadership contest. So the NEC will apply those rules, and we will hear what the timetable is that they set out.
Now, you said in the Observer, it's quite a hard-hitting piece, you said the Labour Party had hunkered down on its 35% strategy, and that was a disaster. Was that really what people were talking about internally at the time?
Well, first of all, it's worth saying I think that Ed grew in stature and led a courageous campaign. I think in many respects we had the most positive campaign in the face of a onslaught from certain parts of the media, but a very negative campaign on the other side. This loss, our failure to win, is not because of the efforts of our fantastic candidates and activists. I saw them, I spent much of my time in English marginals. It's in spite of their efforts that we lost, and of course we've lost some fantastic colleagues.
So why did it happen?
Well, I think first of all we've got to understand this. So draw the right lessons. There will be some who may argue, well, look, but for what happened in Scotland, and of course the results in Scotland were terrible for us, we would have won. Let's be clear, we had a very bad night in Scotland, but David Cameron's majority was won in England. It was the progress and success there that put government out of view for the Labour Party. And let's not forget that, of course, they're going to make these changes to the boundaries, which will make the challenge in England and Wales even greater. But in terms of why we lost, in my view, the Labour Party succeeds and does best when it marries together its compassion for people who can't provide for themselves, for the vulnerable, the poor, with others' ambition and drive and aspiration to get on and do well. And I think in many respects we often had a message which spoke to, for example, people who are struggling on 0 hours contracts. It was right that we tackled that on the national minimum wage, etc. But for, if you like, middle income voters, there wasn't enough of an aspirational offer there. So that was obviously a key issue. And I think also, well, I was going to come on to that, because I also have always argued that ultimately, we're a Labour Party. The clue's in the name. It's about ensuring that people have got good, fulfilling work. And in the same way that I don't think you can argue that you are pro-business if you're always beating up on the terms and conditions of the people who make the business what it is and the trade unions that represent it.
That was the impression, wasn't it?
At times, sometimes. But equally, you can't be pro the kind of jobs that we want to see unless you're backing the people that create them. Now, the irony is in some ways that our policy agenda was thoroughly pro-business, but at times, sometimes people got the impression that it wasn't. And also, of course, our economic competence, which I'm happy to speak about.
Well, let's just stay on the business side, because you were business secretary. Did you actually?
I wish I was business secretary.
Shadow business.
Yeah.
Did you argue hard enough in the kind of inner cadres of the Labour Party against this impression that the party was giving an anti-business, anti-aspirational message? Everyone says it now, but you were there at the time. Did you do enough?
Well, I think ultimately, look, I think Ed was too hard on himself when he said all the responsibility for the failures and the loss. No. Well, let me answer the question. And I don't think it was all of the fault of Ed. This was a collective failure on the part of all of us who were in the front line. And whilst I've always made the argument I just made to you, in terms of the collective message that we were giving, it sometimes gave the impression at times that we weren't with the wealth creators. And you've got to be with the people who create wealth in our country, because they're the people who create the jobs.
Did you fight that 35% strategy, hunkering down over your core voters, when that was discussed in private?
Well, I was never told that there was specifically a 35% strategy, but if you looked at the offer, that is a conclusion that people were entitled to reach. And I think... And
were you worried about it, and did you talk out about it? Did you argue with colleagues about it?
Well, as I said, look, I'm not into attributing blame here, and as I said, it's a collective failure, and I accept my responsibility for that. But look, one of the big strengths of the Labour Party is actually we're the big tent people. We're the people who have got people all over the country in different regions and parts.
For the many, not the few, except it's only the few that voted for you.
We can't have a message that says anybody is too rich or too poor to be part of our party. What the Labour Party does well is build a big tent of people of different backgrounds, creeds, colours, races, religions, economic circumstances. And it's when we have an offer that is big tent and appeals to a lot of people, that's when we win.
The last time you were in government, did you spend too much?
Well, on the economic competence point, and you're right to ask the question, look, going into the crash, should we have been running an albeit small and historically unremarkable deficit? Of course we shouldn't. But the idea...
We should not have done so.
We should not have run...
And so why would the party, why would neither of the Eds, asked again and again and again, ever say that, ever apologise for it? That was a huge mistake, was it not?
In part, part of the reason, I suppose, there has been a struggle around dealing with this issue is while at the same time we shouldn't have been running that small and historically unremarkable deficit, it is ludicrous to suggest, as the Tories have been, that it's because of overspending on the part of the Labour government.
But you could have said all of that a year ago. You could have said, Ed Balls could have said all of that a year ago, and perhaps you'd have had a better election had you done so.
Look, we've got to learn the lessons and learn from the mistakes. And, let's not beat around the bush on this. The facts are we inherited a debt-to-GDP ratio of 42%. We got it down to 37% before the crash. During the Tories' 18 years in government beforehand, they had had a deficit of 3.2%. It had been an average of 1.3% during our time in government. The reason that we had the big debt and deficit issues coming out of the crash was because of the banking crisis. It wasn't because we were spending too much in schools and hospitals in my constituency in Streatham and beyond. And we needed to nail that. But also, there's another very important part to this, is that in terms of illustrating that we took deficit reduction seriously, I think in some quarters there was a nervousness about making the progressive case for balancing the books for fear of being portrayed as being austerity light. And what I'm very clear about, there is nothing progressive in spending more on your debt interest repayments, paying off city investors and others every year, than on housing, than on schools.
Okay.
It is not a progressive thing to be doing that, and we should have said that more clearly in my view.
Now, you've made a very clear statement today and in the newspaper. We assume, therefore, that you're running for the Labour Party leadership.
Well, look, I think it's too early for that at the moment.
That's the old politics.
Well, it might be the old politics, but there isn't even a timetable at the moment. But I certainly intend to play the fullest part I can in rebuilding our party and ensuring that we have the proper debate that we now need to have to make sure we win. And by the way,
that sounds
Andrew,
very close, like a yes. All I'm saying is maybe we're in a stage now after this election defeat where we straight answers to straight questions.
Yes, and I will answer that question. I will give a full answer to that question when we know what the timetable is. But let's be clear. This Labour Party is a fantastic party. We're down, but we're not out. And look, the scale of the defeat is of 92 proportions, but there is no reason why we shouldn't get back in 2020. I don't buy what I've been reading in some of the papers this morning, this idea that somehow this is a 10-year rebuilding project. Absolutely not. We can do this in 5 years if we make the right decisions now and present that aspirational and compassionate case to the British people, which we're so good at. We can do this.
You're thinking about it, aren't you? I can smell it. I can smell it. You're thinking about it. Yes, you said of course, yeah.
Well, of course, we're thinking about the future of the party. But look, let's be clear. You can change the leader, but unless we get the message right, we're not going to win. And I think we can't shy away from some of the arguments perhaps we should have had before now. Because unless we face up to them, how do you deliver progressive values in a fiscally cold climate? How do you do it when technology is changing everything? And how do we make sure that we can pay our way in the world when we're facing more international competition from the likes of India, China and others?
Would you like the Labour Party to settle the leadership question quickly or let it drag on for a few months?
I think the rules were changed to open out the party and build our movement. And so we need to allow time for that to happen.
Chukwuemeka, for now, thank you very much indeed. For the moment, we're going to talk in a moment more to him and to Lord Mandelson, I hope. After this programme, however, there's going to be live coverage of the VE Day commemorations not far away from me in Westminster. But in the meantime, let's take a quick look at what's going to be on BBC Two at 10 o'clock.
Join us at 10 on BBC Two when we're asking one very big question. Has human rights law achieved more than religion for mankind? Join human rights campaigners, lawyers, defenders and believers from many faiths for a big debate on BBC Two at 10.
Thank you very much. Well, Chukwuemeka is still with me, and we've been joined, as I hoped, again by Lord Mandelson. Now, I'm not expecting a kind of laying on of hands here or anything, but he's the kind of candidate who is saying the kind of things that you were talking about earlier on.
Look, I wish Chuka was sitting here as the business secretary because he would have been, building on and taking forward a lot of the things that I believed in and was trying to do when I was in his job. So he has a little weight to go, but I think he'll get there.
You both spoke about Scotland, and in the wastes of election night, I was talking to Charles Clarke, former Home Secretary under Labour, who said he thought the time had come for the Labour Party in Scotland to detach itself from the Labour Party in the rest of the country. A sister party arrangement, always vote together in Westminster and so forth, but it should be a different kind of party, and I wondered what the two of you thought about that.
Well, I think in some senses we've struggled because whilst we've made the case, and I fundamentally believe we need a new, more federal model in the UK for a devolved framework in our country, we haven't quite worked out how that operates within the Scottish Party. And by the way, I think Jim has done an excellent job and in many respects was being given a task I'm not sure anybody would have been able to achieve. Yeah. But don't forget, I mean, one thing I forgot to say, it isn't just the unity of the UK we're looking at, which is potentially under threat, this Parliament. We've also got to make sure that the UK remains a member of the European Union. And I think it's absolutely essential that the Labour Party is at the forefront of that campaign.
Okay, our final thought then with Lord Mandelson, former Commissioner himself. Now, we've always said that David Cameron can't possibly get the deal he wants, many people have, and before he comes back to the EU referendum, an incredibly difficult task. Now he possibly could. He's got the authority, he's got the wind in his back. If he strikes now, he could get the kind of deal that would persuade the Conservative Party to back him in a pro-European referendum, could he not?
Depends what he's going to ask for. I mean, if he goes into those negotiations with an agenda supplied to him by his madcap backbenchers, then he's going to get precisely nowhere. If he goes in with a slightly more intelligent reform agenda, which, by the way, there is a very large constituency of support for across the European Union, then I think he will get somewhere.
What about the idea of a veto for things that we think are against our national interest, as it were, a Luxembourg compromise in English?
Yeah, but do we want to see the French and the Spanish and others doing that too, in vital liberalising reforms that we need, for example, in the single market? Every country has a veto. That's not a European Union anymore.
I would have to say, Andrew, there's lots of analogies with 92 here. I mean, I think the issues and challenges the Prime Minister will face with his backbenchers in this Parliament will make the challenges that John Major faced with the Maastricht rebels look like a complete tea party, and there's an opportunity.
Well, if he's watching, he'll be shaking his head. We will see. Thank you both very much indeed. It's been a very, very interesting morning, but it's all we've got time for. Thanks to all my guests. There's more from the Sunday Politics Show with Andrew Neil on this channel at 1:30. He'll be talking to Labour's Liz Kendall, another potential leadership candidate. Join me again back in the studio next week, but for now, from a much changed Westminster, thank you and goodbye.
With the special service, parade and flypast, the VE Day 70 commemorations continue. Next on BBC One.